The empire of the horsemen once spanned the world. No walls could stop it, no armies could break it. But what happens when the conquerors of the earth have nothing left to conquer? When the storm runs out of sky? In the cold breath of the steppe, the wind still carried his name. Genghis Khan, the scourge of empires, the maker of worlds. His death was a whisper, hidden beneath the thunder of hoofbeats that still echoed across Asia. Yet when the storm finally passed, what remained was silence and the uneasy stillness that follows creation. The empire of the Mongols, once forged by one man's will, now stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. But an empire without its heart is an empire waiting to fracture. The year was 1227. The great Khan's body, wrapped in secrecy, was carried north to an unmarked grave somewhere beneath the sacred mountains. His sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Toluid, gathered around a vision too large for any man to hold. Genghis had united the world through fear and fire, through law and loyalty. But his final commandment, spoken in the language of war, was this: do not let the empire fall apart. For a while, it seemed they obeyed. Ögedei, the third son, took the title of Great Khan, chosen by Genghis himself for his calm hand and practical mind. Under his rule, the Mongols transformed from a nomadic horde into an imperial machine. He built the capital at Karakorum stone upon stone, rising where the grass once swayed untouched. Roads connected the ends of the world. Couriers rode day and night through the steppe carrying news faster than any empire before. The Pax Mongolica, they called it the Mongol peace. Trade flourished. Ideas travelled with silk and silver. Even the stars seemed to move in their favour. But empires born of conquest carry a curse. Peace is not in their nature. Beneath the banners of the Khans, old grudges smouldered like coals under ash. Jochi, the eldest, had died before his father, estranged and shunned, accused by Chagatai of not being Genghis's true son. His descendants in the western steppes remembered the insult well. Chagatai ruled Central Asia with a warrior's pride, fierce and unbending, while Ögedei sought to govern as a ruler of worlds, not tribes. Toluid, the youngest, remained in Mongolia, holding the homeland like a beating heart between them all. It was a balance that could not last. Under Ögedei's leadership, the Mongols completed the conquest of northern China and swept westward into Europe. The Golden Tide reached Hungary and Poland. Kingdoms fell in days. At the edges of the known world, Mongol horsemen appeared like omens, faceless, unstoppable, infinite. Yet in the heart of the empire, something began to shift. The sons of Genghis had learned their father's lessons in war, but not his mastery in unity. For Genghis Khan had ruled not only with the sword, but with the idea, the sacred bond of loyalty that bound every clan beneath his rule. And ideas die more quietly than empires. When Ögedei drank himself to death in 1241, the empire paused, suspended in confusion. The campaigns in Europe stopped as Batu Khan, Jochi's son, turned back from the plains of Hungary to attend the council that would choose the next ruler. The great Khan was dead, and the throne stood empty. The question that haunted every warrior's heart now rose to the surface. Who among them was worthy to sit where Genghis once sat? The council, the Kurultai, met in secrecy, but it was no longer the gathering of one people. It was a parliament of rivals. The blood of Genghis had become a burden more than a blessing. Toluid's widow, Sorgatani Beki, maneuvered skillfully behind the scenes, ensuring that her sons, Mongol, Kublai, and Hulagu, would one day inherit the future. Batu Khan, ruling from the western steppe, sought autonomy. Chagatai's line clung fiercely to the traditions of their father's world, while the Ilkhanate of Persia and the lands of China began to dream of independence. The empire had not yet broken, but its edges had begun to curl inward. In Karakorum, Ögedei's son Guyuk finally claimed the throne. But the great Khan was no longer a king of kings. He was a mediator between jealous princes. Guyuk sought to reassert control, to remind his cousins that there was still one empire, one destiny, yet his reign was short, consumed by the same poison that had devoured so many Mongol hearts, ambition. When Batu refused to attend his coronation, Guyuk marched west to subdue him. But on the journey, he fell ill and died before the first spear was raised. Rumours whispered through the camps that he had been poisoned, others that the spirits of the steppe had abandoned his line. Whatever the truth, the unity of the Mongols died with him. The empire that once moved as one organism now pulsed in four directions. To the west lay the Golden Horde, vast, rich, and restless, under Batu Khan's golden banners. To the south and west, Hulagu would one day carve the Ilkhanate from Persia's broken kingdoms. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate held the ancestral heart of the empire, watching all with suspicion. And in the east, in the fertile plains of China, a young prince named Kublai began to dream of his own dynasty, one that would outlast even the steppe. Yet in these early years of division, none could see the future clearly. To the outside world, the Mongols still appeared invincible. Their armies crushed Baghdad, conquered Kiev, and stormed through Korea. The world trembled at their name, but inside the empire, the silence grew heavier. Each Khan ruled as if his portion of the world were the only one that mattered. The bonds of kinship stretched across deserts and mountains too thin to hold. By the time Mungke, the grandson of Genghis, rose to power in 1251, the empire was a single skin stretched over 4 hearts beating out of rhythm. Mungke tried to restore his grandfather's authority, summoning his brothers to serve him. Hulagu to the west, Kublai to the east. And for a time, it worked. Baghdad burned under Hulagu's hand. The Song of China trembled before Kublai's armies. The Mongols had become kings of the earth, but glory has its gravity. The larger it grows, the harder it collapses inward. Each victory fed not unity but distance between brothers, between khanates, between faiths. The Mongol peace had given birth to something Genghis never intended: identity. And identity, once born, cannot be ruled by fear alone. In the windswept plains of Mongolia, the old shamans said that every empire carries its founder's ghost. Genghis Khan had dreamed of one world, one law, one people. His descendants inherited his empire, but not his dream. What he built through fire, they would lose through inheritance. As the empire of the horsemen reached its zenith, its riders no longer looked toward the same horizon. In China, Kublai Khan studied the ways of emperors. In the west, Batu turned his gaze toward the Volga, building his golden court. Across the deserts of Central Asia, Chagatai's heirs fought among themselves for honor long turned to dust. And somewhere, far from the noise of cities and banners, the wind whispered again across the grasslands of Mongolia, the land that once birthed an empire of thunder, now left with only the echo of hooves. But the silence would not last. Soon, ambition would speak louder than memory, and the empire of Genghis Khan would begin to eat itself. The empire that once moved as a single heartbeat now pulsed in confusion. The world still bowed to the name of Genghis, but his descendants bowed to none. What had begun as a brotherhood bound by conquest was becoming a family at war with itself. After Ögedei's death, the steppe was left in uneasy silence. His widow, Turajin Khatun, ruled as regent, clever, ruthless, and aware that the empire was now more court than camp. She manipulated alliances, placed her allies in positions of power, and ensured her son Guyuk would ascend as great Khan. For the first time, the fate of the Mongol world rested not on the battlefield, but in the chambers of politics. The warriors of the steppe had traded dust and blood for intrigue and betrayal. When Guyuk finally took the throne, he inherited not an empire of fire, but of fissures. Batu, son of Jochi, ruled the western steppe, his golden horde glittering along the Volga like a second capital. He had no interest in bowing to Karakorum. His armies had crushed Eastern Europe, his wealth flowed from trade with Persia and the Silk Road. Guyuk demanded submission. Batu ignored him. Both men gathered armies. For the first time in Mongol history, the horses were not facing foreign enemies, they were turned toward each other. Yet before a single arrow flew, fate intervened. Guyuk died on his way to meet Batu. Suddenly, mysteriously, rumors spread that Batu had poisoned him. Others said the spirits of Genghis punished the Khans for daring to turn their blades inward. Whatever the truth, the great Khan was gone once more, and the steppe was thrown into darkness. It was then that a woman stepped from the shadows of history. Sorgatani Beki, widow of Toluid, mother of Kublai, Hulagu, Arik Bök, and Mungke, became the quiet architect of the empire's next chapter. Where others sought power through the sword, she wielded patience like a blade. Through diplomacy and loyalty, she placed her eldest son Mungke on the throne in 1251. Mungke was disciplined and pious, more scholar than conqueror, but he understood his inheritance was a storm. His brothers Kublai and Hulagu were given vast commands at opposite ends of the empire. Kublai to continue the conquest of China, Hulagu to bring the Middle East under Mongol rule. Each carried the seal of the great Khan, but in truth, They carried independence disguised as obedience. To the west, Hulagu's campaign reshaped the world. With a colossal army drawn from every corner of the Mongol realm, he descended into Persia like a sandstorm. The fabled assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect that haunted mountains and kings alike, were eradicated. Their strongholds fell one by one until their Grand Master surrendered. Then came Baghdad. In 1258, the jewel of the Islamic world faced the Mongol tide. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, refused to surrender. For a week, Baghdad burned. The Tigris ran black with ink from the libraries and red with blood from its scholars and poets. The city that had once been the beating heart of learning was reduced to silence. The Caliph was trampled beneath a Mongol carpet, a symbol of power, crushed by power itself. Hulagu's victory echoed across continents. The world trembled again before Mongol might, yet within that triumph, the seeds of ruin took root. For among his soldiers were Christians from Georgia and Armenia, and his alliances leaned westward. But in the north, Batu Khan, the ruler of the Golden Horde, had converted to Islam. When he heard of Baghdad's destruction, he saw not victory, but sacrilege. Brother turned against brother in spirit, and then in blood. The empire had begun to split not just along lines of power, but of faith. One Mongol believed in the Prophet, another in Christ, another in the eternal sky of Tengri. The unity of belief that had once bound them under Genghis's vision was dissolving like mist under sunlight. Meanwhile, to the east, Kublai was building a different kind of empire. While Hulagu burned cities, Kublai studied them. In the rice fields of northern China, he saw something his ancestors had never dreamed of, a world that could be ruled not by the sword, but by civilization. He employed Chinese scholars, adopted their customs, and began to see himself as more emperor than Khan. Mongol watched all of this with growing unease. The empire was vast, too vast for one throne. When rebellion erupted in China, Mongol decided to lead the campaign himself. He marched south into the humid lands of the Song dynasty, where siege engines replaced cavalry and disease was a more deadly enemy than the blade. In 1259, amidst the marshes and heat, the great Khan fell ill and died. His death was a spark in a dry forest. The empire's generals, scattered across half the earth, felt the tremor. Hulagu, still in the Middle East, received the news with shock and hesitation. To return to Mongolia for the next Kurultai meant abandoning his conquests. To stay meant defying tradition. He stayed. Berke, ruling the Golden Horde, saw an opportunity and a grievance. The death of the Caliph still burned in his heart. Under the banner of Islam, Berke gathered his armies and marched south into the Caucasus to punish Hulagu. It was the first true civil war of the Mongol Empire, Berke's green banners of faith clashing against Hulagu's crimson ones of vengeance. The same tactics that once broke nations were now turned against kin. In one battle along the frozen Terek River, Hulagu's troops tried to retreat across the ice. It cracked beneath the weight of their horses, swallowing them whole. Thousands drowned, their cries muffled beneath the ice. The river carried their corpses downstream, Mongol blood spilling into Mongol land. While the western Khanates devoured each other, the east was no calmer. In Karakorum, Mongol's youngest brother Arik Bök declared himself the new Great Khan. But in the south, Kublai, still in command of the armies in China, proclaimed himself the same. The steppe thundered with a new kind of war. Mongol against Mongol, brother against brother. The Toluid Civil War, they would call it later. Arik Bök had the homeland, the old guard, the shamans, and the memory of the steppe. Kublai had the grain, the gold, and the scholars of China. Their war was not merely for power, it was for identity. What did it mean to be Mongol? A rider on the plain or a ruler of cities? For 4 years, the two brothers fought across Asia. Kublai's banners burned through the north. Arik's armies struck from the mountains. The once united empire had become a chessboard of chaos. The Great Khanate, once the heart of the world, was now a battlefield of inheritance. When Kublai finally triumphed, he did not return to Karakorum. He built a new capital in the east, Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. In time, the world would know it as Beijing. The choice was symbolic and final. The Mongol Empire had become Chinese in body, even if Mongol in name. From the Volga to the Yellow River, every Khan now ruled his own kingdom. Batu's descendants reigned in the west, Hulagu's heirs forged the Ilkhanate in Persia, Chagatai's line clung to Central Asia, and Kublai crowned himself emperor of the Yuan. 4 brothers, 4 realms, each claiming to be the true heir of Genghis Khan, yet none speaking the same tongue anymore. Trade still flowed, armies still marched, and the name Mongol still struck fear across continents, but beneath the surface, the arteries of the empire were severed. The heart that once beat for conquest now beat in isolation, and as Kublai's banners rose above China, a question began to whisper through every khanate, from the golden tents of the Volga to the palaces of Persia. When brothers become kings, who among them dares to be emperor? The winds of the steppe were shifting again this time, toward a storm the Mongols could not outride. The empire of Genghis Khan, once a single flame that devoured nations, now flickered as four separate fires. Kublai Khan ruled the east from his marble courts in China. Hulagu reigned over Persia's mountains and the ashes of Baghdad. Berke, from the banks of the Volga, watched his empire turn from steppe to city, and between them lay the barren heart of Central Asia, where Chagatai's descendants clung to a fading dream of Mongol purity. The storm that once moved outward had now turned inward. In the year 1259, when Mongol Khan's death reached the corners of the known world, the delicate web that held the Mongol universe together snapped. There would be no return to unity, no single leader to bind the tribes again. Each Khanate now felt the pull of destiny in a different direction, and that destiny was soaked in blood. In Mongolia, the old guard gathered in Karakorum. There, Arik Boka, youngest of the Toluid brothers, fierce and proud, declared himself Great Khan in the name of tradition. He was the last defender of the old steppe, the horseman's world his father Toluid had cherished. His banners bore not the symbols of empire, but the simplicity of the open plain, the promise that the Mongols would remain Mongols. Far to the south, in the valleys of China, Kublai received the same news and declared himself Great Khan as well. He no longer rode beneath the eternal blue sky. He ruled beneath silk banners and tiled roofs. To his followers, he was the future. To his enemies, the betrayer of their ancestors. The Toluid civil war began not with drums, but with silence. Messengers were cut down between borders. Supply lines vanished into the desert. Entire armies went missing in the endless grasslands. The empire that had once moved like a living organism now devoured itself limb by limb. Arik Boka held the homeland, the steppe, the loyalty of the traditional clans, and the spiritual legitimacy of the old world. He believed the empire could only survive if it returned to its roots. Kublai, ruling from his fortified command in northern China, had wealth, cities, and grain enough to feed millions. His armies were not riders born of the steppe, but soldiers of empire, engineers, crossbowmen, and bureaucrats with ink-stained fingers. The two visions of the Mongol soul collided like thunderheads. Arik's horsemen raided deep into Kublai's northern territories, striking fast and vanishing into the plains. Kublai retaliated with methodical precision, building roads, fortresses, and siege lines that turned the fluid war of the steppes into a grinding machine of attrition. In the beginning, the war favoured Arik. The homeland gave him strength. The clans rallied behind the memory of Genghis. But the steppe could not feed an empire, and every victory cost him grain he could not replace. Kublai, meanwhile, drew supplies from the great rivers and cities of China. He was learning to rule as an emperor, not as a Khan. For 4 years, they bled each other across Asia. The roads once built for the Mongol postal riders became paths of retreat and pursuit. Traders vanished, caravans burned, and the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, crumbled into memory. And while the brothers tore each other apart, the western Khanates turned their eyes away from Karakorum. Hulagu, far in Persia, heard of the civil war and declared independence in all but name. His Ilkhanate thrived on Persian artistry and administration, growing less Mongol with every year. He minted coins in his own name and ruled from palaces rather than tents. To the north, Berke Khan, the devout Muslim ruler of the Golden Horde, declared himself the defender of the faith. He saw Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad not merely as political violence, but as sacrilege. In 1262, he marched his armies south through the Caucasus, determined to punish his cousin and avenge the fallen caliphate. The Mongol civil wars multiplied like cracks in ice. Hulagu, marching north to meet Berke, sent his son Abakar ahead with a great host. But the Golden Horde knew the terrain, the rivers, the winters, the storms. When Hulagu's troops tried to cross the frozen Terek River, the ice gave way beneath them. Horses and men sank into the freezing current, vanishing into black water. The greatest cavalry on earth, drowned beneath the weight of its own conquest. Neither side could claim victory. Berke was forced to retreat north to the steppe, his armies shattered by cold and famine. Hulagu returned south to Persia, his ambitions frozen along with his soldiers. The Western world, the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde would never again trust one another. Meanwhile, Ulrich Berk's rebellion was collapsing. The clans that had once hailed him as the heir of the steppe now starved in the long winters. Kublai, with his vast granaries and Chinese engineers, began to close the noose. In 1264, surrounded and weakened, Ulrich rode alone into Kublai's camp. He dismounted, removed his bow, and offered his sword to his brother. The old chroniclers say that when he was led into Kublai's tent, the two brothers stood in silence for a long time, one dressed in the silks of empire, the other in the worn leather of the plains. Ulrich Berk surrendered, but his defeat marked something far greater than the loss of a throne. It was the death of the old Mongol spirit. The empire was no longer ruled from the steppe, but from the city. No longer by Khans who rode beneath open skies, but by emperors who ruled beneath tiled ceilings. Kublai, now undisputed Great Khan, turned his back on Karakorum and declared a new capital, Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. The Mongols, who once feared the walls of cities as prisons for the soul, now built one for their own empire. Yet even in triumph, the cracks deepened. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia declared independence in all but name. The Golden Horde refused Kublai's authority. The Ilkhans of Persia followed their own path, intermarrying with Persians and embracing Islam. The unity of Genghis Khan's empire now existed only in memory. Still, Kublai pressed forward. He crowned himself Emperor of the Yuan Dynasty, adopting the language, customs, and systems of the Chinese he had conquered. He built schools, temples, and roads that reached farther than the empire's armies ever had. The world marveled at his splendor. Marco Polo called his court the center of the earth. But in the steppes beyond his palaces, old warriors whispered that the son of Genghis had become Chinese. Kublai's transformation symbolized the fate of them all. The Mongols, who once rode as a single tide across continents, had become 4 different civilizations. Hulagu's Persia was Persian, Berk's horde was Islamic, Kublai's China was imperial, and in the heart of Central Asia, Chagatai's descendants lingered as ghosts of an age long gone. The empire that had united the world under one rule had now birthed a world of divisions, and yet, for all their independence, the Khanates were bound by invisible threads: trade, marriage, memory. Their borders bled into one another, their ambitions collided, their destinies intertwined like the braids of a warrior's hair. For a time, it seemed they might endure in parallel peace. But history has no patience for balance. The same fire that had once consumed kingdoms was still alive within them, restless, seeking fuel. And in the east, as Kublai's Yuan dynasty grew heavy with wealth and complacency, storms began to gather once again. The roads grew dangerous, the governors corrupt, the soldiers soft. The empire that had once been feared by the world was growing too vast, too rich, too slow to react. In the west, Berk's heirs fought each other for thrones. In Persia, the Ilkhans faced revolts. In Central Asia, the Chagataids broke apart into tribes and warlords. The wind that once carried the Mongol banner now carried something else, the smell of decay. And far beyond the horizon, in the lands of their ancestors, the eternal blue sky watched in silence as the empire of Genghis Khan, born in unity, prepared to devour itself completely. Next would come the reckoning, the collapse, the aftermath, and the question that history would never stop asking: how does the greatest empire in human history die? By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire, the once living map that stretched from the Pacific to the Carpathians, was no longer a single body. It was a constellation of Khanates, each orbiting the ghost of Genghis Khan, each claiming to be his rightful heir. Yet none spoke the same language anymore. None dreamed the same dream. The storm had scattered, and the silence that followed was filled with the sound of ambition. Kublai Khan, the last ruler to claim the title of Great Khan with any meaning, had remade the Mongol world in his image. His Yuan dynasty ruled China with splendor unmatched since the Han. His capital, Khanbalik, what the world would one day call Beijing, glittered with marble courtyards, silk banners, and scholars from across the earth. The court of Kublai was a theatre of power. Tibetan monks debated Persian astronomers, European traders haggled beside Mongol generals. The empire of the horsemen had become the empire of the world's ideas. Yet beneath the grandeur, the soil was rotting. The Mongols, who once thrived in the open sky, now drowned in bureaucracy and gold. Kublai's armies, stretched thin across 1,000 leagues, were no longer nomads but garrisoned soldiers, tamed by walls, and waiting for wars that never came. The heart that once beat with the thunder of hooves now pulsed with the hum of court gossip. Kublai himself, aging and heavy, could feel the weight of the empire pressing down. His dream of conquering the seas, the campaigns against Japan, Vietnam, and Java ended not in glory but disaster. Typhoons sank his fleets, disease ravaged his troops, and whispers spread that the eternal blue sky had turned its face away from him. In the steppe, the old Mongols called it divine punishment, proof that the Khan who had become emperor had forgotten his father's gods. While the east grew decadent, the west began to fracture beyond repair. Hulagu's descendants in Persia, the Ilkhans, had once ruled a land glittering with scholars and poets, but the unity Hulagu forged with fire dissolved in the hands of his heirs. Dynastic feud splintered his lineage. His grandson Abaka balanced between Islam and Buddhism, seeking peace between faiths, but finding betrayal instead. The Mongol rulers of Persia no longer spoke Mongol, they spoke Persian. Their armies marched beneath banners written in Arabic script. The conquerors had become the conquered. To the north, the Golden Horde under Berk's line had flourished for a time, their vast plains stretching from the Caspian to the forests of Russia. But after Berk's death, his sons and grandsons turned against one another. Khan after Khan rose and fell, some ruling for years, others for days. Civil war became the rhythm of the Horde's heart. Even as trade along the Silk Road filled their coffers, the steppe warriors grew soft in palaces they once despised. And in the heart of Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate, the old cradle of Mongol tradition, collapsed into dust. Its Khans squabbled over cities instead of herds, the descendants of horse lords becoming landlords. Local emirs seized power, carving the once proud steppe into fragments. The Mongol name still commanded fear, but its meaning was hollow. By the dawn of the 14th century, the great road that once bound the world together, the Silk Road guarded by Mongol banners, began to fray. Bandits ruled where generals once rode. Caravans vanished in deserts once safe under imperial watch. The dream of a world connected by the horsemen of the north had withered, leaving only ghosts. Kublai Khan died in 1294, his body swollen with age and grief. With him died the last living thread to the original vision of empire. His successors, weak and indecisive, ruled over a China that no longer saw them as conquerors, but as foreigners to be expelled. Famine, corruption, and rebellion crept through the land like a slow fire. The Red Turban uprisings ignited the countryside. Temples burned, cities fell. Within a century of Kublai's death, the Mongols were driven from China entirely. The Yuan Dynasty collapsed, and the Mongols who had once ruled the world retreated north back to the grasslands from which they came. But even as the Yuan fell, a darker plague began to move along the veins of what remained of the empire. Traders who once carried silk now carried something else, the Black Death. The same network of roads and ships that had united continents now spread death faster than armies ever could. From the ports of China to the markets of the Volga, the plague devoured everything in its path. The Pax Mongolica had connected the world, and now that connection became its curse. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol world was a memory. The Ilkhans of Persia had no heir. Their dynasty collapsed into petty warlords. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into eastern and western halves, consumed by their own tribal wars. The Golden Horde decayed into rival kingdoms, the strongest of which would one day become the beginnings of Muscovy, its conquerors soon to be conquered in turn. The Mongols had once united the world under the banner of the horse. Now, the world was learning to move without them, and yet their shadow endured. In Persia, Mongol blood flowed through the veins of new dynasties. In China, the Yuan's infrastructure became the backbone of the Ming. In Russia, the systems of tribute and control pioneered by the Horde shaped the Tsars who would rise centuries later. Even their failure was a kind of inheritance, the lesson that no empire, however vast, can escape the gravity of its own size. Still, one last ember of Mongol greatness remained a remnant, distant and defiant. In the east, the descendants of Kublai continued to rule in name, their courts shrunken, their banners faded. And in the far reaches of Central Asia, a young warlord would soon rise from the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate, Timur, who would claim the legacy of Genghis for himself. His armies would once again sweep through Persia, India, and the Levant, calling themselves the Sons of the Mongol Empire. But even Timur's conquests were only echoes, reflections of a glory that could never truly return. By the time the dust settled, the Mongol Empire had become a myth, a warning whispered across centuries. The world remembered the thunder of their hooves, the fire of their wrath, the reach of their law. But it also remembered their undoing the moment when victory turned to vanity, when brothers turned to enemies, when empire turned to echo. No foreign army had defeated the Mongols. No external power had dismantled their system. The empire that had conquered the known world was undone by its own abundance. The steppe warriors who once ruled by discipline had been conquered by comfort. What began as the unity of one man's vision ended in the entropy of too many ambitions. And yet, the spirit of Genghis lingered in the wind that crosses Mongolia's open plains, in the ruins of Karakorum, in the endless steppe beneath the eternal blue sky. His descendants had devoured the world and, in the end, devoured themselves. The empire that once united humanity under a single banner was gone, but its shadow stretched across history like twilight that never fully ends. The Mongols had changed everything: the map, the faiths, the flow of trade, and time itself. But the lesson they left behind was older than empire and truer than conquest. That power, when stretched too far, ceases to hold. That greatness, without unity, becomes its own destruction. And so the world's greatest empire did not die in battle or collapse from invasion. It consumed itself from within, leaving behind only silence and the whisper of hoofbeats fading into eternity. But even silence has an echo, and centuries later, the children of the steppe would rise again, dreaming of the empire their ancestors lost, wondering if the shadow of Genghis Khan would ever truly fade. The Mongol Empire began as the dream of one man and became the greatest dominion the world had ever seen. From the thunder of Genghis Khan's rise to the splendor of Kublai's reign, it united continents, rewrote maps, and bridged civilizations. But the empire that conquered the earth could not conquer itself. Ambition turned to rivalry, brothers to enemies, unity to dust. The world that once trembled beneath their horses' hooves watched as the Mongols consumed their own legacy. Yet even in ruin, their shadow endured, shaping nations, borders, and the course of history long after the last Khan fell. This was the rise, glory, and self-destruction of the world's greatest empire, the Mongols after Genghis. If you felt the tremor of history in this story, the clash of ambition, the fall of unity, and the haunting echo of empire, then join us on this journey through the ages. Like this video if the story of the Mongols moved you, and subscribe so you never miss the next saga that shaped our world. Every empire leaves behind a question, and every question leads to another story. Should we next explore the rise of Tamerlane, the last heir of Mongol fury, or perhaps the story of the Mamluks, who stood against the unstoppable tide and changed history at Ain Jalut? Maybe the Romanovs, the Ottomans, or the Aztec civilizations that, like the Mongols, danced between greatness and destruction. Tell us in the comments what tale of power, betrayal, and legacy you want to see next. Your choice shapes where we ride from here. Because history never dies, it just waits to be remembered.